So tonight, we will be discussing the series, the final part of the series, The Gospel Changes Everything. And we've talked about how there's redemption, there's restoration, and tonight is blessing. I want to read to you guys kind of the thesis for tonight. I've done this before, but for those of you who have that little scholarly side, or you've written papers, which all of you probably have, a senior thesis for high school or senior paper, whatever they call it, kind of have an over-encompassing statement about what the discussion with that paper will be on. But tonight I wanted to read this to you. Throughout the process of understanding the revelatory concept that the gospel changes everything, we must begin to understand God's desire to bless us. So the question is, have we sacrificed true depth and meaning of what blessing really is? Have we become comfortable with the structure of God's blessing that is merely temporal and limited within the scope of our perspective? So that's kind of the focus of tonight in discussing it. Blessing. What does that mean? Quick recap for those of you who might not have been here. When we talk about redemption, we spoke of how we're lost. We're eternally damned, separated from God. Death entered the world. From man sinning caused this schism. And from that point, no matter what we did wasn't good enough. We needed God to rescue us, to redeem us, to save us. Now last week we discussed about restoration. Though we were rescued and though we were saved, we still need to be healed. And that process of healing has to take place. And the restoration that Christ can bring in our life is not just momentary, but it's every day. It's in that relationship every day. But now tonight, the story doesn't end there. The gospel of Jesus Christ continues in our life. Him changing us, Him saving us. And for all eternity, we can understand that we are a blessed people. But first, as I always love to do, we have to kind of converse and dialogue about the misconceptions of what blessing means. So, blessing has often been misunderstood, especially within Christianity. Sometimes we might have seen certain examples of it. Maybe it's only something that is monetary. It's just about kind of money, wants, desires, status, relationships. We take those and we say, this is what blessing is. This is how I quantify my blessings in those things. There's like a little, creak in this area, but it sounds like a gremlin is like under there. Before there was four of us, and just side note, before there was four of us guys here and the stage was off-center by like a foot, these are all separate pieces, and this is ridiculously heavy. So there was four of us for like 10 minutes trying to push it with all we had, and it was not budging. Do you know how degrading that is, this man? We're like, and nothing was happening. And we added one more person, and we pushed it slowly, but we pushed it. So, that's all, just so you know. That's what goes on. Blood, sweat, and tears before you even come here. People are pushing stages of gremlins. Okay, so, but, I think in many ways we have those misconceptions. You might know what I'm talking about. Maybe you've encountered that, or that's in your own world perspective. This is what I'm saying. These aren't wrong. They're not wrong, but it can kind of hit more of a shallow understanding of what blessing is. And I know sometimes in our statement we talk about shallow. We might say that person's shallow, and it's in a very negative context. Well, that's not what I'm defining that word tonight by. I'm defining it legitimately by what it means, shallow. Low, small, less, no depth. Okay? So maybe we've seen those things, how we conceive what a blessing is. We have all those ideas. It's relationships, it's status, it's provision, it's all that stuff. And yes, those things are true, and I'm not negating that those are overflows from God's blessings, but in no way is it the foundation. In no way is it the heartbeat or the depth of what real blessing from God is. So see, when we dialogue about shallowness and that understanding of it, I want to unpack that more. Because I know some of you might be there and say, this is a message that it's frustrating me, or are you breaking those things down? No, listen to what I'm saying here, okay? Shallow literally in this context is saying it's limiting God's definition of his blessings in our life to what we can tangibly fathom, desire, or even understand. So within our realm of understanding, our time, where we're living here and the now, we take those things and that shallowness of it, which is natural as humanity, and we say, this is what blessing is, because it's only limited within our perspective. Can't get any bigger than that. But what happens in shallow water? Well, it's easily contaminated. Easily contaminated. Because it's shallow. It dries up really easy. Right? Many times in desert areas, there could be an oasis, has all this natural water, these beautiful things, and then in a matter of weeks it can dry up instantly. There's no depth found there. So what we're doing tonight is we're taking a deeper understanding of what God's blessing really, truly is. Because when those things, relationships, money, title, provision, when all those things fade away, God's true blessings still remain. And that's where depth of understanding comes in. That's why you can stare at some people's lives who have suffered great tragedy, tribulations, and trials in their lives and loss. Yet they'll still look at you and say, the blessing of God is still in my life. That's what we're going to talk about. There's a story I want to share with you. Parable of the lost son. Some of you might know it as the prodigal son, right? Anyone ever read that story before, heard it? You might have read it in a literature class, in Sunday school, in a Bible study, in a college class, whatever it is. Read the story of the prodigal son. Well, it takes place in Luke 15:11-32. So you can turn to that if you want. And I'm going to share the story with you so you can turn to that and check my facts. You said that part out of order there. Don't holler out. Come tell me afterwards so I'm not embarrassed. We're going to read that. We're going to talk about this story. Jesus is sitting down with his disciples and others around him, and he's sharing throughout the book of Luke, here in those chapters 13, 14, and 15, different snapshots, different stories of individuals. This one, perhaps, is the most famous, and I think the most meaningful, because in this story we see restoration take place. We see redemption take place, and we see blessing. All of those take place. So, there was two sons. They came from a wealthy and rich family. There was the older son and the younger son, and they had a father. Father who was wealthy, he owned land. At this time when Jesus is talking, anyone who was the landowner was a very wealthy individual there in the Middle East. Still to this day, we kind of have that same idea. People own a certain amount of things. There's wealth with it. So these two sons are there. The younger son, one day, comes and he looks to his father. He says, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. Now we're going to pause there because we have to look at the context, the culture, what's taking place here. So in Middle Eastern culture, and Jesus is talking to that crowd there, younger sons did not inherit nearly as much as the older son did. All right, so if you were a younger son, it's almost like an even little joke in that time would have known, like younger sons are normally a little bit more irresponsible. You know, they don't really do that much around there. They're a little lazy and all that. Because in reality, the younger son's like, hey, no matter what, my older brother's getting more. Probably around 3/4 of everything, if not even more than that. Maybe 75, 80% of everything my father owns, he'll get, and I'll get the 20%. So the younger son approaches him and says that. But here's another thing. You wouldn't get your inheritance unless your dad was dead. Okay? You wouldn't get your inheritance unless your dad was dead. And on top of that, a son would never approach his father with a question. That was disrespectful. Or even in this way, in a presumptuous way, in an order. Give me all this. That was extremely disrespectful during this context and this culture. So this is what this son says in that one statement. I wish you were dead because I want everything you're going to give me. I have no respect for you or my family because I'm approaching you and telling you to do this, and I want to leave. That's the disrespect that this son is approaching his father. So the father sees a very loving, generous, graceful father. He says, okay, I'll divide the property between the two sons. So both the older son and the younger son get their share, and the younger son goes off. And it says he went off to a distant land, and there he had money, he had wealth, and he squanders it all. However you want to paint that picture, however you want to see it. He's going, he's giving money away. And the context of what Jesus is sharing here, it's this idea that it's not a positive thing. He wasn't investing his money in creating this amazing agricultural business. No. What he was doing was he was laying with prostitutes. He was with the drunkards getting drunk. He was wasting all his money, gambling it, throwing it all away. It says at this time he did it and squandered it till it was all gone. His whole inheritance. And then a famine hits the land. And he finds himself, this young son, he finds himself in a distant place, far away from home, squandered all his money and inheritance, everything he owned, and he finds himself with nothing. He's desperate. He needs food. He needs to eat. So he becomes a hired man. We'd even say, oh, he's a hired hand, right? We might use that and talk about that, and there's something we have to understand culturally, though. Slaves were even higher in the class system than a hired hand. Because a slave was with a family. There was some sense of provision there. They got food, they had housing, they had this. But a hired hand was basically just someone who was wandering, trying to find jobs here and there. So most of the times, these were thieves or homeless beggars. So he becomes a hired hand to a man out in the country, and he's feeding pigs. That's his job. Let's pause again there. I love pausing and looking at the history and the culture that surrounds these stories because it brings more depth to it. He's feeding pigs. Now, to a Jewish family, and Jewish man, by Levitical law, Leviticus 11:7-8 says, the pig is unclean, do not eat their meat or even touch their carcasses. He's at the lowest of the low of the low. He is feeding what they would call unclean animals. Not just touching them. He's laying with them. He even gets to a point where suddenly he even tries to eat their food. The scraps that he's feeding. So we might say, oh, pigs. Oh, what is that? Babe. It's babe, right? It's all this stuff. Piglets. But this and that understanding, Jewish custom, so unclean, so dirty. They wouldn't enter a home that even had a pig. Nevertheless, go eat. So it's at this moment, the lowest of the low, that he has a realization. He says to himself, the son, even the servants in my father's house eat better than I eat now, have a covering over their head. So he has an idea. He says, I'll go back to my father. I'll apologize for what I've done. I'll tell him I am no longer worthy to be his son, but I will beg him to be a servant and a slave. So he begins his journey back home. It says, while he was a long distance off, the father sees him and runs to him. Let's pause. Understand this. Jesus, when he's communicating this story, he says the father sees him from a long distance. The father was always looking for his son. Every day the anticipation with his eyes peered, will my son come back? Where is my son? He sees him from a long way off. And we know also that from that, if he sees him from a long way off, then the story is taking place this moment here during the day. Which means people were out. People were around in the town. And many times during this, if you were a wealthy man who was a landowner, many times you would be on higher ground. The better ground. And under there would be different people and lower class as it went lower and lower in elevation. And so from this, we're understanding this picture. He sees him from a long distance off. His son who brought shame to him, his son who said, I wish you were actually dead, disowning the family, all that it is, sees it and he runs to him. Middle Eastern culture, anyone of high rank or class would never run. You know why? They had robes. And if they had robes, they had to run. What would they have to do? Girls, if you're in a long prom dress or wedding dress, what are you doing? You're pulling it up, right? And running. I practiced. And I said, what are you doing? Come on, dress. Sorry. So you're running. And the reason you have to lift up your skirt, your dress, whatever it was, so that your legs would be seen, right, in that moment. If not, you wouldn't see them. Listen, in Middle Eastern culture, showing legs was extremely dishonorable, shameful. Actually, there's some ancient Jewish tradition in writing that says if a bird goes under your robe on the Sabbath, leave it there till it gets dark so no one can see you try to shake it out and your legs show. I know. So this high-ranking man who the whole village knows, the whole town knows, that this man's son didn't just spit in his face. He basically said, Father, I wish you were in the grave. I want nothing to do with you. Give me my inheritance. I'm out. He shamed him. Embarrassed him. This father, it says, ran. And the literal Greek word there is referring to sprinting, which literally is what runners would do in a race. Now, this is so wild to me. In some older Arabic translations, they didn't even want to put the words run in this story in the scripture because of how degrading it was in that moment. So they put other words like, he presented himself or he went. Because the exposure of one's legs in high ranking to do that was just so shameful. And obviously, through translating later manuscripts, they changed it back to what the original word was. Running. His father runs to meet his son outside of the town. And as he's running, holding his robe up, in shame when people are looking at him, oh my goodness, his legs. He's running through there. This father, what is he running to? No man of rank would ever sprint or run. And who's he running to? His son. The one who shamed him. Because that father is getting there even before this son comes to the town. Because he took the shame before his son would walk through that town. And the townsmen and people would look at him with disgust and anger and say, you gross. You're horrible, you should have your head down. But before he could even get into the town, the father meets him there, runs to him, takes the shame upon himself that they would all see that. And what does he do? He greets him with kisses. In that culture, that time, just like very much here in New York and in the whole New England area, hugging and kissing is a sign of affection. But in that culture, if you kiss someone multiple times and you kept kissing, you're showing forgiveness, restoration, honor. So this father runs, wraps his arms around his son, takes that shame, not caring, because his son had come home. And before the son can even get his words out, before he can say his whole big spiel, I realize, Dad, that even before your servants and all this are getting, before he can even get out, his father says this to his servants around him. Bring a robe, the best one. Every family in this time would have had a best robe, a high-ranking garment is the actual word that it meant. And so this father was the high-ranking individual of his home, of his land, even of the town and the village. And he says, bring my finest robe and place it on my son. Bring a ring and put it on his finger. And that ring would have been a crest. It would have been the very thing that they would put in wax and seal to show that they were with that family. It identified them as an individual, a part of that family. A signet ring. He says, put a ring on his finger. Sandals on his feet. Only masters and the son of masters would wear sandals. Slaves and hired hands, normal villagers, they wouldn't have sandals. They would be barefoot. Put sandals on his feet. Kill the fatted calf. Let us die. He says, my son who is dead dead is alive. Who is lost is found. Man, what a story. That son walked through understanding his need of redemption, needing to be rescued from the state he was in. He's restored at that moment when his father runs to him. But he is blessed beyond what he could have even fathomed. But his father lifts him up, not just as a distant son, not just as someone trying to get his trust back. No. Reinstated and even lifted higher by giving him his own robe, his raised his sins. The blessing of God. There's something special where this message comes directly into our lives, our hearts. We have been adopted as the sons of God. I want to read to you Romans 8:14 through 17. Paul's writing now. He says, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father," that word symbolizing intimacy, Daddy, like an infant would cry out. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. Paul's writing this, and the word adoption he used is so specific. And actually, that word is used in Galatians and Ephesians as well. All cities connected with Rome, with Roman influence. Now, I had discovered this fact when I was talking with Dan Hickey. He's a part of the table here. We were talking about this whole sonship idea, and he shared this fact with me. Then after he shared it with me, I went and even did more reading up on it, and I was shocked at what adoption meant to a Roman culture. In ancient Rome, they viewed that the children you were born with were basically given to you. You had no choice. You had no choice. Son, daughter, that's what it was, and that's who you got. But adoption was something you chose. And actually, during those times, adoption wasn't looked down upon in any way. It was a very esteemed place. Because there was something special. Someone who was born naturally to a family, they could be disowned and taken out of the inheritance. Easily. But someone who was adopted could never be taken out of their inheritance and never be disowned. Because they chose them. And forever they would be their child, their son. So actually, to the crowd, to the group, the culture Paul's talking to, adopting a son had a stronger position than even if you were a son by birth. And he says, we've been adopted. You, me, we've been adopted. Be sons and daughters of God. We didn't deserve it. We've been adopted. Listen, Paul doesn't end it there. Because constantly throughout this whole session we've been talking about, there's a theme in here, and the gospel changes everything. There's a theme with redeems, restores, and blesses. And that theme is that every single one of these actions and these acts is tied to Jesus Christ. And that's why Paul goes further to say we are co-heirs with Christ. Because it's through Christ and what he did for us, his death, his resurrection, that you and I can become sons and daughters. And you and I can experience the blessing of being God's children and God's blessings. The world and people around us will try to take Christ out of everything they can, and understanding that I am standing here and saying this, without Jesus Christ, none of this is possible. Without Jesus Christ, we can't experience the blessings of God. Without Jesus Christ, restoration, redemption, those things can't come about, because the depth of it is eternal. And it extends past the temporal, and it extends into your life and my life, being called sons and daughters of God. We have a place at his table. And I'm going to invite the band. You guys can make your way up here. We have a place at his table. Listen, I want to read Psalm 23, 5 through 6. You guys can turn there if you have your Bibles, or you can just listen. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. We know that. It goes further down in verses 5 through 6, and it says this. It says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. If you go back up to verse 5, it says, you anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. I sit at your table. Is he sitting at a table and breaking bread with someone? And the psalmist writes this is a sign of loyalty to one another and a covenant that was being made. That's why Jesus, the Last Supper, first practice of the Eucharist there, he does something. He breaks bread. Symbolizing, he says, the new covenant that will come about. It allows you and allows me to be the sons and the daughters of God, to sit at his table, to be heirs of God, our Almighty King. And it says at the end of that, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Death, trials, tribulations, unexpected things cannot take us away from the table of his love and grace. Those things can take away relationships. Those things can take away money. Those things can take away status. But they can never take away your place at the table of God. It can never take away your place as a son and the daughter of God. That's the blessing we live in. And that's why this blessing isn't shallow, but it's depth. It's got roots in it. If we can take hold of that, then we can become a people who are tied with the heart of God. Because at the end of that story with the prodigal son, there's another part. It's the son who remained the whole time. He hears a feast going on. He walks up and he won't go into the party, and his dad comes out and he says, Dad, I have been here working, never complaining, never doing anything wrong, always being obedient to who you are. And yet my brother who lays with prostitutes, my brother who squanders everything, who shames your name, you put a feast for him, you give him a robe, you kill the fatted calf for him. And the father looks at him and at the end he says, Son, let us rejoice. Your brother who was lost has been found, who is dead is alive. This is what's taking place. We need to become a people who learn to rejoice for those who are blessed. We need to become a people who don't get overcome by jealousy, or this is unfair, or that person has so many blessings and I don't, or that person has this. Not at all. Because really what Christianity is, really what Jesus is saying here is let's put down our status, let's put down all the things we've done and all these things, and let's learn to take hold of the Father's heart. The gospel is unfair, and that's what makes it beautiful. It's unfair because none of us deserve it, but he gave it to us. He gave it to us. He gave it to you, and he gave it to me. So let's stand up. As we worship the Lord, I just encourage all of you. We can become a people who identify our blessing in the sonship, in being a daughter of God, of his grace, encompassing his redemption, his restoration, and all of that. And understanding that the truth is there is overflow to that, and I would never stop saying that. There's overflow to that of blessings with relationships, and there's overflow to blessings where God gives you provisions, elevates you in certain places to have influence for him. But here's the deal. Even all that stripped away, we never lose it. We never lose being a child of God. So even now, if you were someone who kind of walked away from God, you feel like you're that prodigal, it's never too late to come back. It's never too late to come back. Right now, let's just worship the Lord for who He is.